It was a frigid winter night when the blizzard howled outside in the remote cabin hidden deep within the forest. Orin was completing his evening routine, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth. The wind pounded against the windows like an impatient guest, and the moonlight barely penetrated the swirling snow. Orin, a man who valued his solitude, hadn't anticipated anyone venturing this far from civilization. Then came the knock. It was faint yet persistent. Orin froze, his breath catching. No one traveled this deep into the woods, not in this weather. Grabbing a heavy jacket and a flashlight, he approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, he was met with a sight he could hardly comprehend. A woman stood there, wrapped in a torn, shimmering cloak that seemed ill-equipped for the freezing cold. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale hue that almost appeared to reflect the moonlight. Her large, iridescent eyes locked onto his. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "let me in. I won't survive out here." Orin hesitated. This wasn't just any woman. Her elongated features and subtle patterns glowing faintly along her neck and arms marked her as something extraordinary. His heart raced, but the sight of her shivering, frost-bitten hands pushed him into action. He stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "Hurry." As she stumbled into the cabin, he noticed the way she moved, graceful yet strained. As if unaccustomed to the weight of gravity, she collapsed near the fire, clutching her cloak tighter around her. Orin watched as the frost melted from her hair, revealing strands that shimmered like starlight. "Who are you?" he finally asked. The woman looked up, her expression a mix of gratitude and fear. "My name is Thais," she said. "I've traveled a long way. Please don't send me back out." Her trembling form didn't just imply she was cold. It screamed desperation as she clung to the tattered remnants of her cloak. Orin realized she wasn't going to last long. Her lips were a pale silver, her breath hitching as if her lungs were struggling to adjust to the icy air of Earth. He gently guided her toward the fire, pulling a blanket off the back of the chair to drape over her shoulders. "Sit here," he said firmly, though his voice was softer than he anticipated. "Warm up. I'll get something hot for you." She gave a small nod, her enormous eyes following him as he moved across the room. He tried to focus on the task of heating water for tea, but his mind was racing. She didn't look entirely human, that much was clear. Her skin shimmered faintly like moonlight rippling on water, and the patterns along her neck seemed to pulse softly. Like veins carrying not blood but light, even her hair was remarkable, cascading down her shoulders in strands that reflected subtle hues of violet and silver. "Human," she murmured, pulling the blanket tighter around her as she sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fire. The single word caught him off guard. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it, with a blend of awe, fear, and relief. "Yeah, I'm human," Orin replied cautiously, setting a steaming mug of tea down beside her. "And you're not." She hesitated, her delicate fingers wrapping around the mug. Her hands were long and slender, with faintly glowing tips that looked almost crystalline. She sipped the tea slowly, as though testing it before speaking again. "No, not," she admitted, her voice lilting and melodic. "But I need your help, please." There was a vulnerability in her tone that made Orin's defenses waver. Still, the situation was too strange to accept without question. "You're going to have to give me more than that." "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" She lowered her gaze, her expression tightening. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she took a deep breath and spoke. "My name is Thais. Her words trailed off, her brows knitting together as if struggling to find the right translation. "I'm not from here. My ship, it broke. I didn't know your winters would be this harsh." Her voice trembled again, and he could see the genuine fear in her eyes. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Orin studied her closely, trying to assess the truth of her words. She didn't appear to be a threat, quite the opposite. Her fragility and desperation were disarming. Still, she was an alien, and that meant she might bring trouble. He didn't live in this secluded cabin for enjoyment. He valued his privacy, his safety. Letting her stay would disrupt the quiet life he had carefully constructed. But there was something about the way she looked at him with those wide, luminous eyes that tugged at his sense of compassion. She was alone, clearly terrified. And if what she said about her ship was true, she was stranded. "You can stay for now," he said finally, his tone firm but not unkind, "until you figure out what to do next." Her eyes widened slightly, and for the first time he saw a faint smile curve her lips. It was subtle, almost shy, but it transformed her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and full of gratitude. "I will not forget this kindness." "Don't thank me yet," Orin muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I have a feeling this is going to get complicated." The hours stretched into the night as the blizzard outside continued to rage. She didn't say much, and neither did Orin. but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. She seemed content to sit by the fire, her hands wrapped around the mug of tea, her eyes fixed on the flames. Orin found himself stealing glances at her as he busied himself around the cabin. There was an otherworldly elegance to her, an almost ethereal grace even in her exhausted state. But it wasn't just her appearance that intrigued him. It was the quiet strength she exuded, the way she carried herself despite clearly being out of her element. As the storm began to ease, Orin decided to break the silence. "So, Thais," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter, "you said your ship broke. Does that mean you're stuck here, or are you waiting for someone to come looking for you?" Her expression darkened, and she looked away from the fire. "No one is coming for me," she said quietly. "I left them behind. I left who behind? My people." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They wouldn't understand why I couldn't follow the path they set for me. I had no choice but to leave." There was a weight to her words that Orin didn't fully grasp, but he could tell it was painful for her to discuss. He decided not to press further, at least not yet. "Well," he said, trying to keep his tone light, "you picked a hell of a place to crash. Middle of nowhere in the dead of winter." A faint smile tugged at her lips again, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't intentional. They fell into silence again, but this time it was Thais who spoke first. "Your world, it's harsher than I expected, but it's beautiful too. The snow, the stars, even the firelight, it's alive." Orin raised an eyebrow. "Alive?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the flames. "On my world, everything is controlled, predictable. Even beauty is manufactured. But here everything feels raw, untamed. It's overwhelming, but in a good way." Her words caught Orin off guard. He had never thought of his world that way before, but hearing it through her perspective made him see it differently. "You'll get used to it," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Her gaze shifted to him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something unspoken in the way she looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that he couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely audible. And for the first time in years, Orin felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of connection, fragile but undeniable. As the fire burned low and the cabin grew quiet, Orin set up a makeshift bed for Thais on the couch. "It's not much," he said, gesturing to the pile of blankets and pillows, "but it'll do for tonight." She smiled faintly, her expression soft. "It's more than enough. You've already done so much for me." As she lay down, cocooned in the blankets, Orin felt an inexplicable urge to protect her. He didn't know what had brought her to his doorstep or what she was fleeing from, but one thing was clear. She didn't belong out there in the cold, alone and afraid. For now, at least, she was safe. And as the storm finally began to die down, Orin found himself wondering what the coming days would bring. The first rays of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, painting the cabin in a dim golden glow. Orin woke early, as he always did, his body accustomed to the rhythm of rural solitude. He stretched and threw on his heavy wool sweater before quietly moving toward the kitchen to start the coffee pot. The events of the previous night felt almost surreal in the early light. When he turned toward the couch, his breath hitched. Thais was still asleep, but there was something otherworldly about the way she rested. Her face, soft and serene, was tilted toward the firelight that flickered faintly in the hearth. Her silver-toned hair had spilled over the edge of the couch, glowing softly in the dim light. It wasn't just her physical appearance that struck him, though. There was a kind of vulnerability in her that he couldn't quite explain. She didn't just look like a stranger in his home. She looked like someone lost, someone in desperate need of anchoring. He shook his head and busied himself with coffee. As the rich aroma filled the cabin, he heard a soft rustling behind him. When he turned, he found her sitting up, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her luminous eyes blinked sleepily, focusing on him. "Morning," Orin said, his voice low. Thais tilted her head slightly, as if the word was unfamiliar. "Morning," she repeated softly, her accent caressing each syllable. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up the pot. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the steaming mug he was pouring. "I don't know what that is." Orin chuckled softly. "It's not going to hurt you, trust me. It'll warm you up and wake you up at the same time." He handed her a mug, watching as her long fingers wrapped around it cautiously. She sniffed at first, her delicate nose wrinkling slightly before taking the smallest sip. Her expression shifted, her lips parting in mild surprise. "It's bitter," she said, her voice lilting with curiosity. "You get used to it," Orin replied, taking a sip of his own. She stared into the dark liquid for a moment before speaking again. "Your hospitality, it's not what I expected from your kind." That made him pause. "My kind, what exactly were you expecting?" Theis's gaze dropped to her mug, her expression unreadable. Fear, suspicion, maybe even hostility. Well, to be fair, Orin said, leaning against the counter, I did think you might be here to rob me or worse. But you didn't exactly look like a threat half frozen on my doorstep. Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile. I owe you more than I can say. If it weren't for you, she trailed off, her voice tightening. You'd have frozen out there, he finished for her, his tone softening. Look, I don't know what you're running from or how you ended up here, but you don't have to explain everything right now. Just take it one step at a time. Theis's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment she held his gaze. You're different, she said quietly. Different how? She hesitated, her luminous eyes searching his face. You don't look at me like I'm an anomaly. You look at me like I'm someone. Orin wasn't sure how to respond to that. There was something raw and honest in her words, something that caught him off guard. Maybe I'm just used to living out here, he said finally. Keeps me from judging too quickly. Theis nodded, her gaze dropping back to the mug in her hand. That's rare. As the day unfolded, Theis stayed close to the fire, her movements tentative as though she were still unsure of her place in the cabin. Orin tried not to crowd her, sensing that she needed space, but he couldn't help stealing glances at her as he went about his chores, his curiosity growing with every passing hour. She spent much of the morning observing him, her luminous eyes following his every movement. He could feel the weight of her gaze as he chopped wood outside, the rhythmic crack of the axe echoing in the cold air. When he brought the freshly split logs back inside, he found her standing near the window, her hand pressed against the frosted glass. It's so untamed, she murmured, her breath fogging the window. What is? Orin asked, setting the logs by the hearth. Your world, she turned to face him, her expression tinged with wonder. It's wild and unpredictable, nothing like where I'm from. Where are you from? He asked cautiously. Theis hesitated, her fingers brushing against the blanket still draped over her shoulders. Far away, she said finally. A place where everything is controlled, regulated. Even the sky doesn't change. Orin frowned. That sounds stifling. It is, she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. That's why I left. I wanted to see something real, something alive. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Orin could see the longing in her eyes, the deep ache for something she couldn't quite put into words. You found it, he said quietly, but I'm guessing it's not exactly what you expected. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. No, it's more. By midday, the blizzard had eased, leaving the landscape blanketed in a thick layer of pristine snow. Orin took the opportunity to check the perimeter of the property, his boots crunching through the ice-crusted drifts. Theis watched him from the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself despite the heavy blanket. You should stay inside, he called out, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She shook her head. I want to help. Orin didn't argue. Together, they walked the edge of the property, checking the fence line and clearing snow from the generator. Theis moved with surprising grace, her steps light and deliberate. As they worked, Orin found himself stealing glances at her. She didn't seem fragile anymore. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a determination that intrigued him. You're tougher than you look, he said as they finished clearing the generator. She glanced at him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. You'd be surprised what I've endured. Something in her tone made him pause. He wanted to ask more, to understand what she had been through, but he held back. Instead, he handed her a thermos of hot tea, watching as she took a long sip. Thank you, she said softly, her gaze meeting his. For what? For trusting me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Orin wasn't sure what to say to that. He had never considered himself particularly trusting, but with her it felt natural. As night fell, the cabin grew quiet again. Theis sat by the fire, her expression distant as she stared into the flames. Orin joined her, sitting on the floor with his back against the couch. Theis, he said after a long silence. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. You said you left your people. Why? She hesitated, her hands tightening around the mug of tea in her lap. Because I couldn't live by their rules anymore, she said finally. They believe in control above all else. There's no room for individuality, no room for freedom, he finished for her. She nodded, her expression softening. Yes, freedom. That's what I wanted. But it cost me everything. Orin frowned. And now you're here alone. Was it worth it? Her gaze met his, and for a moment he saw something raw and unguarded in her eyes. I don't know yet, she admitted. The honesty in her voice struck a chord in him. He didn't know why, but he felt an unspoken connection to her, as though they were both searching for something they couldn't quite name. You're not alone anymore, he said quietly. Theis's eyes widened slightly. and for the first time he saw a flicker of hope in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. And as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Orin realized that his life had already begun to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. The following day began with a peculiar sense of normality. Thais, though still somewhat reserved, had started moving around the cabin with more confidence. Orin caught her gazing at everyday objects like they were works of art: the smooth handle of a spoon, the grain of the wooden floorboards, even the hum of the refrigerator. Her fascination was almost childlike. Though her sharp, knowing eyes betrayed a mind far older and more complex, Orin found himself watching her, studying the way she interacted with his world. He couldn't help but wonder how different her life must have been before she ended up on his doorstep. She had let slip bits and pieces of her past, but nothing that gave him the full picture. As he was chopping wood outside, she stepped out onto the porch wrapped in one of his oversized coats. The coat swallowed her slight frame, but it did nothing to dim the glow of her silvery hair in the sunlight. Her bare feet left faint imprints in the snow, though the cold didn't seem to bother her. "You're not used to this kind of cold, are you?" Orin called out, pausing mid-swing. She tilted her head, considering his question. "Not this kind of cold, no, but I've been in places just as harsh." Orin set the axe down, leaning against the chopping block. "Like where?" Thais hesitated, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "Places where the sun never sets," she said softly. "Where the air feels heavy and you can hear the hum of machinery even in the quietest moments. Places where the ground is polished metal, not soil." Her words sent a shiver down his spine, though not from the cold. He couldn't imagine living in such a place, and yet her voice carried a strange fondness, as if she missed it even though it had driven her away. "What brought you here then?" he asked, his tone gentle. She hesitated again, her fingers gripping the edges of the coat. "I didn't have a choice," she admitted. "Once I left them, I had to keep moving. I didn't know where else to go." Orin frowned. "Them?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped off the porch, her bare feet crunching in the snow as she walked toward him. She stopped a few paces away, her luminous eyes locking onto his. "I'm not like you," she said finally, her voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "I'm not human." Orin blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. "I figured as much," he said after a moment. The eyes kind of gave it away. She smiled faintly, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "And yet you let me in." "You begged," he replied, his tone light. "What kind of man would I be if I turned someone away in a storm?" Theis's expression softened. Not many would have done the same. Orin shrugged, though her words stirred something in him. "You're here now," he said simply. "That's all that matters." As the day wore on, Orin found himself growing more curious about Theis. She had opened up a little, but he could tell there was more she wasn't saying. He didn't want to push her, but the questions lingered in his mind, demanding answers. When night fell, they settled by the fire again. This had quickly become their routine. Him on the floor, her on the couch, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Orin," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yeah?" He turned to look at her, noting the seriousness in her expression. "There's something you need to know," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "About me, about why I'm here." He nodded, sitting up straighter. "I'm listening." Theis took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket draped over her lap. "My people, they're not like yours. They don't value compassion or individuality. Everything we do is for the collective, our unified purpose. There's no room for weakness, no room for failure." Her voice grew tighter, and Orin could see the pain in her eyes. "I wasn't supposed to leave. No one ever leaves. But I couldn't," she broke off, her hands trembling slightly. "I couldn't be part of it anymore." Orin reached out instinctively, placing a hand on hers. "You don't have to explain everything right now," he said softly. "Take your time." Theis shook her head. "You deserve to know. You've taken me in and I've put you at risk." "Risk?" Orin frowned. "What kind of risk?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to their joined hands. "They'll come for me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The collective doesn't tolerate deserters." Orin's grip tightened slightly. "And what happens if they find you?" Her eyes met his, and the fear in them was palpable. "I don't think either of us would survive." Orin's mind raced as he tried to process what she had just told him. He had suspected there was more to her story, but he hadn't anticipated this. The idea of some faceless, powerful force coming after her and possibly him was unsettling to say the least. "Why here?" he asked finally. "Why come to Earth?" Theis hesitated, her gaze drifting to the fire. "Because it's different, untouched by the collective. Your people still value things like kindness and freedom. I thought maybe I could find a new life here." Her words stirred something deep within him. He had always thought of Earth as chaotic and flawed, but hearing her describe it like that made him see it in a new light. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "We'll figure it out together." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she looked as though she might argue. But then she nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Orin. I don't know what I would have done without you." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard, and he felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. He had always thought of himself as a solitary man, content with his quiet life. But now, with Thais here, everything felt different. As the fire crackled softly, he found himself wondering how far he would go to protect her, realizing with a start that he already knew the answer. Later that night, as they sat in comfortable silence, Thais surprised him by speaking again. "There's something about you," she said, her voice soft. "Something grounding." Orin glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Grounding?" She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Your presence, it's steady, uncomplicated. It's not something I've ever experienced before." He chuckled softly. "You make me sound like a rock." "Not a rock," she corrected, her lips curving into a faint smile, "more like an anchor." Her words hung in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Orin felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, curiosity, and something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. "You're safe here," he said finally, his voice firm, "no matter what happens." Thais's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing her hand over his. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for everything." And as the firelight flickered around them, Orin realized that his quiet life had been irrevocably changed, and for the first time he didn't mind. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Despite the looming threat of the collective, Orin and Thais found themselves carving out a fragile sense of normality. He introduced her to more of his world, cooking meals together, tending to the fire, and listening to music from his old radio. In turn, she shared glimpses of hers, weaving fragments of her past into stories that were equal parts haunting and beautiful. Orin found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. Thais's vulnerability, her quiet strength, and the way she viewed the simplest things with wonder all captivated him. He caught himself watching her more often, studying the way her silver hair shimmered in the sunlight or how her luminous eyes flickered with emotion when she spoke of her struggles. One evening, as the snowstorm raged outside, they sat by the fire once again. Orin was repairing an old lantern, his fingers working deftly with the tools while Thais watched him from the couch. She had taken to sitting cross-legged, wrapped in one of his thick blankets, her head tilted as if she were studying him. "You're different," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Orin glanced up, his brow furrowing. "Different how?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the flickering flames. "From the others I've met, humans, I mean. You're steady, patient. Most people I've encountered were either afraid of me or wanted something from me." Her words stirred a pang of sadness in him. He set the lantern down, leaning back against the chair. "I'm not sure that makes me special," he said lightly. "Just decent." She smiled faintly, though her eyes carried a weight that spoke of deeper emotions. "It makes you more than decent, Orin. It makes you rare." Her words lingered in the air between them, and for a moment Orin didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to compliments, especially ones that felt so genuine. Instead, he cleared his throat, shifting his focus back to the lantern. "I guess I just know what it's like to need someone," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a vulnerability he rarely let show. "And not have anyone there." Thais's expression softened, and she unfolded herself from the couch, crossing the small space to sit beside him on the floor. Her proximity sent a jolt through him, but he kept his gaze on the lantern, pretending to fiddle with the tools. "You've been alone for a long time, haven't you?" she asked gently. Orin nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "So have I," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even when I was surrounded by my own kind, I was alone. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from not belonging anywhere, from feeling like you're always out of place." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He set the lantern aside, turning to face her. "You belong here," he said firmly. "With me." Thais's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she looked as though she might cry. But then she smiled, a soft, radiant smile that took his breath away. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think I could feel this way again, like I'm safe." Over the next few days their bond deepened in ways that neither of them could fully explain. They moved through the cabin like two halves of a whole, their unspoken understanding growing stronger with each passing moment. Thais began to smile more, her laughter soft but infectious, and Orin found himself doing things just to hear it, like telling her absurd stories from his childhood or teaching her how to play cards. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she surprised him by asking a question that had been on her mind for some time. "What is it like?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Orin looked up from the book he was reading. "What's what like?" "Love," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Among your people." Her question caught him off guard, and he set the book down, leaning forward slightly. "That's a big question," he said after a moment. "I guess it's different for everyone. But at its core, I think it's about connection, about finding someone who makes you feel like you're not alone." Thais considered his words, her expression thoughtful. "We don't have love. Not the way you describe it. The collective doesn't allow for personal attachments. Everything we do is for the greater good, our purpose. There's no room for feelings." "That sounds lonely," Orin said, his voice soft. "It is," she admitted. "But I never realized how lonely it was until I came here, until I met you." Her words sent a rush of warmth through him, and he found himself reaching out, his fingers brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, letting their palms press together. Her skin was cool to the touch, but her grip was steady, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Orin," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know if I can ever be what you deserve, but I want to try." "You don't have to be anything other than who you are," he said firmly. "That's more than enough." That night, as they prepared for bed, Orin found himself lingering outside her room. He had offered her the spare bedroom when she first arrived, but most nights she ended up falling asleep on the couch. This was the first time she had voluntarily retreated to the room, and he wasn't sure why he felt so reluctant to leave her there. Before he could overthink it, he knocked lightly on the door. "Thais, you okay?" There was a brief pause, and then the door opened, revealing her standing in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. She was wearing one of his old flannel shirts, the hem brushing against her thighs. Her silvery hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, and her eyes shimmered with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I just didn't want to be alone." Orin's chest tightened, and without thinking he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You're not alone," he said softly. "Not anymore." Her gaze searched his, and for a moment it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Then slowly she stepped closer, her hands trembling as they reached for his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Before he could respond, she leaned up on her toes, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was both tentative and filled with unspoken emotion. It wasn't perfect. Her movements were uncertain, as if she wasn't entirely sure what she was doing. But it was real, and that was all that mattered. When they finally pulled away, she rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said softly, "but I know I want to face it with you." Orin wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "We'll face it together," he promised. And in that moment, as the storm raged outside, they found a sense of peace they hadn't known they were searching for. The winter stretched on, and with each passing day, the bond between Orin and Thais grew stronger, more unshakable. The storm that had once howled mercilessly outside their cabin now seemed a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of their shared presence. Despite the harshness of the world they lived in, a strange peace had settled in the small space they had carved out together. But the shadow of the collective still loomed over them. Thais had been clear from the beginning. Her escape from the collective was a temporary thing. They would come for her eventually, and when they did, everything would change. Orin knew this in his bones, and though he never spoke it aloud, the uncertainty gnawed at him. It wasn't the fear of losing her. He'd already accepted that possibility. But the fear of what would happen when the collective came, of what they would do to her, to him, and to the fragile life they had built in this forgotten corner of Earth, still lingered. Every day they pushed the threat aside. They lived in the present, cherishing every moment as though it might be their last. And in the stillness of the night, when they lay together beneath the thick blankets, Thais would often whisper, "I never thought I could feel this way. I never thought I could belong." Orin would hold her tighter, his heart aching because he understood. For the first time in years, he knew what it meant to feel like he had a place, a home, and it was here with her. The reckoning. The morning the collective arrived, it wasn't the loud explosion of a military attack, nor the piercing sound of spacecraft breaking the silence of the sky. No, it came in the form of a soft knock on the door, a knock that in its calmness sent a chill down Orin's spine. He was at the window before he realized he'd moved, his gaze searching the horizon. There on the edge of the trees a small ship hovered, its sleek design unmistakable. The collective, Thais's people. the ones who had trained her to be nothing more than a tool, a weapon for their war against the galaxy. And now they were here, in his home. Orin didn't speak for a long moment, his mind racing with the weight of what was happening. He heard Thais stirring behind him, heard her soft footsteps approaching. "I knew this day would come," she said, her voice calm but heavy with resignation. She placed her hand on his shoulder, a gentle touch that conveyed everything, her fear, her sorrow, her love for him. "I'll go with them," she said. "It's the only way they'll leave you alone." "No," Orin turned to face her, his eyes fierce, burning with a resolve that surprised even him. "You don't have to do that. We can fight. We'll find a way." Her eyes met his, soft and knowing. "You've always been willing to fight for me, but I can't let them take you. I'll go with them. I'll go back to my people, and I'll make them understand. I'll make them see that I'm not a weapon. I'm not theirs to command." Orin swallowed hard, the words heavy in his chest. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't bear the thought of her walking out the door, disappearing into the void of the unknown. But deep down he knew she was right. This wasn't his fight, this was hers. "Then I'll go with you," he said, his voice unwavering. "I won't let you face this alone." Thais's gaze softened, her lips trembling with a mix of sadness and gratitude. "Orin, you're everything I've ever wanted, everything I never knew I needed. But this is something I have to do for myself, for both of us." The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped inside, tall and imposing with a glint of recognition in his eyes. Orin knew immediately it was a representative of the collective. The man wore a dark uniform adorned with the insignia of their order, his face cold and unreadable. Thais straightened beside Orin, her posture regal, but there was an undeniable tremor in her hands. "I'm ready," she said quietly. The man nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to Orin before returning to her. "Come with me, Thais. The collective has no room for weakness, but your choices have made you a singular case. We will decide your fate." Orin stepped forward before he could stop himself. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice low but firm. "She stays here with me." The man's gaze shifted back to him, a cold smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You misunderstand, human. The decision is not yours. You're nothing more than an obstacle to her future. But perhaps we'll allow you to accompany her if you know what's best for her." Thais stepped between them, her presence a shield. "He's not an obstacle," she said, her voice steady. "He's everything, and I will never be theirs again." The collective agent hesitated, his expression flickering for a brief moment. Then with a curt nod he turned away, signaling for her to follow. Orin took a step back and Thais paused at the threshold. She turned to him one last time, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I love you," she whispered, her voice a soft promise. "Never forget that." "I love you too," Orin replied, his voice thick with emotion. And then, with a final glance, she was gone. Days passed in a haze. The storm had ended, but its remnants clung to the land like a memory of something lost. Orin stood alone in the cabin, staring out the window, watching the last traces of snow melt under the early warmth of spring. He had no way of knowing where Thais was or what was happening to her, but he refused to lose hope. She had promised him she would return, and he believed her. In the meantime, Orin kept their home alive, working the land, tending the fire, living the life she had taught him to embrace. He would wait for her, and when she came back, because he knew in his heart he would be there, ready to face whatever came next. The world outside was vast and the future uncertain. But one thing was clear. Love, true and unbreakable, had found its place in the most unlikely of places, and for that he was willing to fight. The end.